Nothing breaks a mother's heart like watching her child suffer. Nothing makes a child braver than seeing their mother in chains. 7-year-old Elara walked into the Emperor's throne room with mud on her feet and tears on her cheeks. No one had dared enter without permission in 20 years. But when your mother is accused of treason and facing death, rules don't matter anymore. "Please help my mom," she whispered to the most powerful man in the empire. Emperor Quintan had crushed armies and ruled nations, but he'd never faced anything like this little girl's courage. His answer shocked everyone in the royal court. He would save her mother, but only under one condition that would change everything. What could make a ruthless emperor offer such a deal to a desperate child? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before a small girl would change the fate of an empire, the morning mist hung over the province of Noritia like a gentle blessing. In the cottage at the edge of the village, where wildflowers pushed through the cracks in stone walls and herbs grew in careful rows beneath kitchen windows, Mira Caldwell knelt beside a laboring mother, her weathered hands gentle as prayer. "Breathe with me, Elena," she whispered, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had welcomed countless souls into the world. "Your body knows what to do. Trust it." The cottage smelled of lavender and chamomile, scents that had become synonymous with Mira's presence throughout Noritia. Her leather healing pouch, worn smooth by 20 years of use, sat open beside her, displaying neat compartments filled with dried herbs, clean linen strips, and small glass vials of tinctures she prepared by candlelight. Each item had its place, just as Mira had found her place in this village after losing her husband to the wars 5 years ago. Elena's husband paced outside, his boots wearing a path in the dirt as he had for the past 12 hours. Through the window, Mira could see other villagers gathering, offering quiet support as they always did when new life was about to enter their small world. This was how things worked in Noritia. People cared for each other because no one else would. "I can see the head," Mira announced, her eyes bright with the joy that never dimmed, no matter how many births she attended. "One more push, dear one." From the corner where she'd been quietly helping, 7-year-old Elara looked up from the clean linens she'd been folding. Her dark hair fell in waves around a face that held her mother's determination and her late father's gentle eyes. She'd been present at dozens of births, old enough now to be truly helpful, rather than simply curious. "Mama," Elara whispered, as Elena's final push filled the cottage with the sharp cry of new life. "She did it," Mira smiled, lifting the tiny, perfect child into the golden morning light streaming through the window. "She certainly did." "Elena, you have a beautiful daughter." As Mira cleaned and swaddled the baby with practiced efficiency, Elena reached for her hand. "What would we do without you? You've brought half the village into this world, and I've been honored to do it," Mira replied, settling the baby against Elena's chest. "Every child is a gift. Every safe delivery is a blessing." Outside, the celebration had already begun. Elena's husband burst through the door, his face transformed by joy, and soon the small cottage filled with neighbors bringing food, flowers, and the kind of genuine happiness that made Noritia feel like family rather than simply a place to live. As the day wore on and the new mother rested, Mira and Elara walked home through the village center. The marketplace buzzed with its usual activity. Farmers selling vegetables, the blacksmith repairing tools, children playing between the stalls while their mothers bartered for household goods. Everyone they passed offered genuine smiles and grateful nods. "Mira," called Thomas the baker, emerging from his shop with flour still dusting his apron. "I heard Elena had her baby. Is everything well?" "Mother and daughter are perfect," Mira replied, accepting the small loaf of fresh bread he pressed into her hands. "Thank you, Thomas. No payment needed. After what you did for my Martha when she had trouble with our youngest. We're forever in your debt." This was Mira's life, woven into the fabric of the community through thousands of small acts of service and kindness. She delivered their babies, tended their sick, eased the passing of their elderly, and asked for nothing more than simple gratitude and the occasional meal when times were lean. Their cottage sat at the village's edge, small but comfortable, with a garden that provided both food and medicine. Elara helped tend the healing herbs, learning to distinguish between chamomile and feverfew, understanding which plants calmed pain and which ones encouraged sleep. It was a peaceful life, predictable in the best possible way. "Mama," Elara said as they prepared dinner together, "why do the soldiers come through our village so often now?" Mira paused in chopping vegetables, considering her answer carefully. The child was observant, too observant sometimes. The truth was, the tensions had been growing throughout the empire for months. Emperor Quintan's rule had become increasingly harsh, his responses to any hint of rebellion swift and merciless. The outer provinces like Naurisha bore the brunt of heavier taxes and stricter enforcement, while whispers of organized resistance grew louder each week. "The empire is going through difficult times," Mira said finally. "Sometimes that means more soldiers, more questions, more worry for everyone. Are we in danger?" Mira set down her knife and pulled her daughter close. "We're simple people, Elara. We help others and keep to ourselves. That's not dangerous." But as she spoke the words, Mira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. 3 times in the past month, Imperial soldiers had questioned villagers about rebel sympathizers. Twice, they'd searched homes looking for weapons or seditious materials. The atmosphere in Naurisha had grown tense, with people watching their words more carefully and trust becoming a luxury few could afford. That night, as autumn wind rattled their shutters and Elara slept peacefully in her small bed, Mira sat by the fire, mending a torn dress. The cottage felt especially cozy in the lamplight, filled with dried herbs, hanging from the rafters, and shelves lined with her medical supplies. This was the life she'd built from grief and determination, a good life, a meaningful life. The knock came near midnight. Mira's hand stilled on her sewing as someone rapped urgently at her door. Late-night calls weren't unusual in her line of work. Babies arrived when they chose. And emergencies didn't wait for convenient hours, but something about this knock felt different, desperate. She opened the door to find a young man collapsed against her doorframe, blood seeping through a makeshift bandage around his shoulder. His clothes marked him as a traveler, but the quality of his boots and the silver buckle on his belt suggested someone with means. His face was pale with pain and exhaustion. "Please," he gasped, "I need help. I'm hurt badly." Mira didn't hesitate. "Come inside, quickly." She guided him to a chair near the fire, immediately assessing his wound with professional efficiency. The bandage was crude, but had likely saved his life by slowing the bleeding. Underneath, she found a deep gash from what looked like a sword cut. "What happened to you?" she asked, gathering supplies from her healing pouch. "Bandits," he said, though something in his voice made her wonder if that was entirely true. "They attacked my party on the road. I was the only one who escaped." As Mira cleaned and stitched his wound, she studied his face. He was perhaps 25, with intelligent eyes and hands that showed more evidence of holding a pen than wielding a sword. Not typical bandit prey, and certainly not dressed like someone who couldn't afford better protection while traveling. "You're very skilled," he said, watching her work. "Are you the village healer?" "A midwife primarily, but I treat what I can." She finished the last stitch and began preparing a poultice. "This should heal cleanly if you keep it clean and dry." "I'm grateful." "More grateful than you know." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. "Who are you, really?" He met her eyes steadily. "Someone who fights for what he believes is right." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that made Mira's heart race. She'd heard similar phrases whispered in the marketplace, seen the same look in the eyes of young men who disappeared in the night and returned weeks later with new scars and haunted expressions. "I don't want to know," she said firmly. "I treat anyone who needs help, but I don't ask questions about politics or causes. I have a daughter to protect, I understand, and I wouldn't ask you to risk her safety." He stood carefully, testing his newly bandaged shoulder. "I'll be gone before dawn. Rest until then. You've lost too much blood to travel safely in the dark." He settled onto the small cot she indicated, and within minutes his breathing had deepened into exhausted sleep. Mira sat watching him, her mind churning with worry. She'd meant what she said. She helped anyone who needed it. But she also understood that in times like these, even acts of basic human decency could be twisted into evidence of treason. When morning came, she woke to find him gone. But a small stack of silver coins sat on her table, along with a note, "For your kindness and skill. May we all live to see better days." Mira hid the coins and burned the note, hoping that would be the end of it. She went about her normal routine, tending to Elena and her new baby, checking on an elderly man with persistent cough, and helping Elara with her lessons. It felt like any other day in their peaceful life, but that afternoon, as golden sunlight slanted through their cottage windows and Elara practiced her letters at the kitchen table, the sound of horses approached their door. Many horses. Through the window, Mira saw Imperial soldiers in full armor, their red cloaks marking them as the Emperor's personal guard rather than local peacekeepers. Their leader, a stern man with lieutenant's insignia, dismounted and approached her door with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his authority unquestioned. "Open in the name of Emperor Quintan." Mira's blood turned to ice. She looked at Elara, who had dropped her quill and was staring at the door with wide, frightened eyes. "Stay calm," Mira whispered to her daughter. "Remember what I've taught you about being brave when others need you to be strong." She opened the door to face 6 mounted soldiers and their commander. "Mira Caldwell?" the lieutenant asked, consulting a scroll. "Yes, you're under arrest for the crime of aiding enemies of the Empire." The words hit her like a physical blow. There must be some mistake. "I'm a midwife. I help deliver babies and treat the sick. Last night you gave aid and comfort to a known rebel operative. We have witnesses who saw him leaving your cottage this morning." Mira's heart sank as she realized someone in the village, someone she'd trusted, had betrayed her. "I treated an injured man. That's what I do. I didn't know who he was." "Ignorance is not a defense against treason." He gestured to his men. "Bind her, please," Mira said as rough hands seized her arms. "My daughter, she has no one else. The child will be cared for by the village until your trial." As they dragged her from her home, Mira looked back to see Elara standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, but her small chin raised in defiance. In that moment, Mira saw herself reflected in her daughter, the same stubbornness, the same refusal to surrender to circumstances beyond their control. "I love you," she called out as they lifted her onto a horse. "Remember that whatever happens, I love you more than life itself." The last thing she saw as they rode away was Elara running after them, her small voice carrying across the fields. "Mama! Mama, come back!" But the soldiers didn't stop, and soon the cottage, their life, their world, disappeared behind the hills. The imperial arrest warrant bore the golden seal of Emperor Quintan himself, a document that transformed lives with the stroke of a pen. As the soldiers disappeared with Mira bound and helpless on horseback, that same warrant fluttered in the autumn wind, dropped carelessly by one of the guards, and now caught against a fence post like a death sentence made manifest. Elara ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, collapsing in the middle of the road where the dust from the horses still hung in the air. Villagers emerged from their homes, drawn by her desperate cries, but their faces showed fear rather than sympathy. Word traveled fast in small communities. Everyone already knew why the Imperial Guard had come. "Poor child," whispered Martha, the baker's wife, but she made no move to comfort Elara. None of them did. Association with accused traitors was dangerous, even for children. Thomas the baker, the same man who had given Mira bread just hours earlier, avoided Elara's pleading eyes. "You can stay with us tonight," he said quietly, "but tomorrow you'll need to find other arrangements." "We can't risk—" "She's 7 years old," snapped Elena, still weak from childbirth but fierce in her defense. "Her mother delivered my daughter yesterday. Have we forgotten so quickly?" "We can't forget our own families either," Thomas replied, his voice heavy with guilt but firm in his resolve. "The Emperor's justice falls on anyone who aids traitors." "Would you risk your newborn for sentiment?" Elena fell silent, and Elara understood with devastating clarity that her world had shattered completely. Not only was her mother gone, but the community that had embraced them both had suddenly become a place of whispered conversations and averted gazes. That night, sleeping on the floor of Elena's cottage while the new baby fussed in her cradle, Elara made a decision that would have impressed her mother with its courage and terrified her with its danger. If the adults of Noritia were too frightened to help, then she would have to save her mother herself. She'd heard the stories every child in the Empire knew. Emperor Quintan was the ultimate authority, the final voice in all matters of justice. If she could reach him, if she could explain that her mother was innocent, surely he would listen. Surely he would understand. The next morning, before dawn touched the eastern hills, Elara crept from Elena's cottage with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's leather healing pouch, which the soldiers had left behind in their haste. Inside, along with the familiar herbs and remedies, she found the silver coins the wounded man had left. Enough, perhaps, to buy passage to the capital. The journey to the imperial city would normally take 3 days by horse, 5 by wagon, and perhaps 8 on foot for a grown man. For a 7-year-old girl traveling alone, it seemed impossible. But Elara had inherited her mother's determination along with her healing knowledge, and desperation made her resourceful beyond her years. She hid in merchant wagons, slipping aboard when drivers stopped to water their horses, and curling up between sacks of grain or bundles of cloth. When discovered, her story was always the same. She was traveling to visit relatives in the capital, separated from her family by bandits. Most merchants, softened by her obvious distress and innocent appearance, gave her bread and water before setting her down at the next town. The capital city of Aurelia rose from the central plains like a golden dream made real. Elara had never imagined anything so vast. Buildings that stretched toward the clouds, streets wide enough for 20 horses to ride abreast, and people everywhere, more people than lived in all of Noritia. The noise overwhelmed her. Vendors shouting their wares, cartwheels rumbling over cobblestones, conversations in a dozen languages mixing into a constant hum of urban life. The imperial palace dominated the city's heart, its white marble walls and golden domes visible from miles away. As Elara made her way through increasingly crowded streets, the buildings seemed to grow larger and more imposing with each step. Guards in gleaming armor stood at every gate, their faces hidden behind ceremonial helmets that made them look more like statues than men. At the main entrance, she approached a guard whose red cloak marked him as one of the Emperor's personal regiment. "Please, sir, I need to see the Emperor." The guard looked down at her as if she were an interesting insect. "Child, the Emperor doesn't see petitioners without appointments. His calendar is booked months in advance, but it's important." "My mother, go home to your parents before you get lost in the city. My mother is in your dungeons. She's innocent, and I need to tell the Emperor that she didn't do anything wrong." The guard's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of human sympathy. "What's your mother's name?" "Mira Caldwell. She's from Noritia. She's a midwife, and she only helped someone because he was hurt. And now they're going to—" Elara's voice broke as the reality of her situation hit her fully. "I'm sorry, child, but there's nothing I can do. The Emperor doesn't hear personal appeals about criminal cases. Your mother will have a trial." "When?" The guard hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Tomorrow at dawn, tomorrow." The word hit Elara like a physical blow. After 3 days of traveling, sleeping in alleys and begging for food, she'd arrived with barely hours to spare. The trial would be a formality. Everyone knew that accused traitors rarely survived imperial justice, especially when the evidence included harboring known rebels. "Please," she whispered, but the guard was already turning away, his duty to ignore her clearly established. Elara spent the rest of the day circling the palace, looking for any way inside. The building was a fortress as much as a residence, with walls 20 feet high and guards at every entrance. Servants went in and out through smaller gates, but they were checked carefully and knew each other by name. As afternoon faded to evening, desperation drove her to attempt what would have been considered impossible by any reasonable person. During a shift change, when the guards were distracted by their formal exchange of duties, Elara slipped through a service entrance behind a group of kitchen workers carrying large baskets of vegetables. The palace interior was even more overwhelming than its exterior. Marble columns stretched up to painted ceilings that depicted scenes from imperial history, their colors so vivid they seemed to glow in the lamplight. Tapestries worth more than entire villages hung from walls inlaid with precious stones, and everywhere she looked, gold gleamed in intricate patterns that spoke of power beyond imagination. Elara had no idea where to find the emperor, but she reasoned that someone so important would be in the most impressive room, in the most impressive building in the empire. She followed corridors that grew increasingly grand, dodging servants and guards by ducking behind statues and slipping through doorways when no one was looking. The throne room doors stood 30 feet high, carved from what looked like single pieces of ebony and decorated with the imperial eagle in gold relief. 2 guards flanked the entrance, but as evening approached, their attention was focused on the formal court session ending inside rather than on a small figure creeping along the wall. When the doors opened to allow courtiers to file out, Elara saw her chance. She darted between the elaborate robes and ceremonial uniforms of departing nobles, keeping low and moving quickly toward the source of the voices still echoing from within. The throne room was the largest space she'd ever seen, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows while great windows filled the far wall with the last light of day. At the room's center, elevated on a dais of white marble, sat a throne carved from a single block of gold-veined stone, and on that throne sat Emperor Quintan. He was not what Elara had expected. The stories painted him as a giant among men, a figure of such imposing presence that enemies fled at the sight of him. The reality was more complex. A man in his late 50s, tall but not enormous, with iron-grey hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. He wore simple robes rather than elaborate regalia, and his face showed the weight of decisions that affected millions of lives. He was alone except for a few remaining advisors, reviewing documents by lamplight as the day's formal business concluded. This was her moment, perhaps her only moment. Elara stepped from behind a pillar and walked across the vast marble floor, her bare feet making no sound, but her heart beating so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. With each step, the throne grew larger, the man upon it more imposing, but her mother's face drove her forward. "Your Imperial Majesty," she said, her voice small but clear in the enormous space. Every head turned toward her. Advisors gasped, guards reached for weapons, and shocked silence filled the throne room. But Emperor Quintan simply looked at her with those intelligent eyes, his expression unreadable. "Please help my mom," Elara said, her words echoing off marble walls and golden columns, carrying a child's desperate love into the heart of imperial power. The imperial crown of empresses sat in its crystal case in the royal treasury, untouched for 20 years. Its sapphires caught the lamplight like captured stars, while gold work so intricate it seemed alive wound around precious gems in patterns that told the story of an empire. But for all its beauty, the crown had become a symbol of Emperor Quintan's greatest failure, his inability to find a partner worthy of sharing his throne and his burden. In the throne room, the silence stretched like a drawn bowstring as courtiers and guards processed what they'd just witnessed. A child, a dirty, exhausted, clearly common child, had somehow penetrated the most secure building in the empire and was now standing before the emperor himself, asking for help with the casual directness that only children possessed. Chancellor Aldrich recovered first, his face flushing with outrage. "Guards! Seize this child immediately! How dare she—" "Wait!" Emperor Quintan's voice carried absolute authority, stopping the guards mid-step. His eyes remained fixed on Elara, studying her with the intensity he usually reserved for matters of state. "What is your name, child?" "Elara Caldwell, Your Majesty." My mamma is Mira Caldwell, and she's innocent. And what makes you think she's innocent? The question surprised the courtiers. They'd expected immediate punishment for the breach of protocol, not an actual conversation. But Elara answered without hesitation, because I was there when she helped the hurt man. She didn't know who he was. She just saw someone bleeding and helped him because that's what she does. She's delivered half the babies in our village and never turned anyone away, not ever, even when they couldn't pay. General Marcus, commander of the Imperial Guard, stepped forward. Your Majesty, the child's presence here is a serious security breach. The child walked through your security as if it didn't exist, Quintan observed dryly. Perhaps we should be more concerned about that than punishing her for your failures. The general's face reddened, but he said nothing more. Quintan rose from his throne, and for a moment Elara understood why men feared him. Even in simple robes, he radiated the kind of power that came from making life-and-death decisions every day for 20 years. But when he approached her, his voice was surprisingly gentle. You've traveled far to reach me. 3 days, Your Majesty. I hid in wagons and walked when I had to. You came all this way for your mother. She's all I have, and she's good. She's the best person in the whole world. Something flickered across the Emperor's face, an expression so brief that only someone watching closely would have caught it. Pain, perhaps, or recognition of something he'd lost long ago. Your mother stands accused of treason, he said carefully. That's a serious charge, but you can fix it, can't you? You're the Emperor. You can pardon people. The simplicity of her faith in his power was both touching and heartbreaking. Quintan had spent decades learning that imperial authority, while vast, came with constraints that few understood. Laws, precedents, political necessities all bound him as surely as chains. It's not that simple, child. Why not? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the throne room, advisors and courtiers watched their emperor struggle with something they'd never seen him face, the moral clarity of a child who saw the world in terms of right and wrong, rather than political expedience. Chancellor, Aldrich seized the moment. Your Majesty, surely we're not going to allow this interruption to continue. The child has committed a serious breach of security, and her mother, Quintan said quietly. It will have a fair trial according to imperial law, a trial that will result in execution, Aldrich pressed. The evidence is clear. She aided a known rebel operative. She helped someone who was hurt, Elara said, her voice rising with desperation. That's not a crime. That's what good people do. In times of war, child, Aldrich replied with cold satisfaction. Good intentions are insufficient. The law is clear about those who aid enemies of the Empire. Quintan studied the Chancellor's face, noting the eagerness there. Aldrich had always been quick to advocate for harsh justice, claiming it was necessary for imperial stability. But lately, his enthusiasm for punishment had begun to concern the Emperor. What would you have me do? Quintan asked Elara, though his question seemed to encompass more than just her mother's situation. Save her. You have the power. Use it, and what would you give in return? Justice requires balance. The question was meant to teach her about the complexities of rule, but Elara's answer surprised everyone in the room. Anything. I'll give you anything you want if you save my mama. Anything? Quintan's voice carried a strange note that made several courtiers exchange nervous glances. Yes, Your Majesty. Anything at all. The Emperor walked back to his throne, but instead of sitting, he stood beside it, one hand resting on its carved arm. When he spoke, his words fell into the throne room like stones into still water. Very well. I will spare your mother's life and pardon her of all charges. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Chancellor Aldrich stepped forward, his face pale with shock. Your Majesty, surely you cannot. But Quintan continued, his eyes never leaving Elara's face. In exchange, your mother must agree to become my Empress. Today, the throne room erupted. Courtiers whispered frantically among themselves. Guards shifted nervously, and Chancellor Aldrich looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. General Marcus's mouth fell open in complete astonishment. Your Majesty, Aldrich stammered, This is impossible. A commoner cannot. The bloodlines, the protocols, I am the emperor, Quintan said with quiet finality. If I say a woman can be empress, then she can be empress. Elara stared at him, trying to process words that made no sense in her 7-year-old understanding of the world. I don't understand. What's an empress? The emperor's wife, General Marcus explained gently, his military directness cutting through the political complexity. The woman who would rule beside him. My mama would be a queen. An empress, Quintan corrected. And yes, she would rule beside me, share my throne, and bear the responsibilities of the crown. But why? Elara asked, her innocent question cutting to the heart of what everyone in the room was thinking. Quintan was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried 20 years of loneliness. Because an empire without heart is no empire at all, and perhaps a woman who would risk everything to help a stranger and raise a daughter brave enough to walk into this throne room for love might have the heart this empire needs. Chancellor Aldrich's face had gone from pale to red to purple. Your Majesty, the implications of such a union, the political ramifications, this decision cannot be made in haste based on the pleadings of a child. Can it not? Quintan's voice carried an edge that reminded everyone present why he'd ruled successfully for 2 decades. Tell me, Chancellor, what has our careful political consideration given us? An empire where children must risk their lives to seek justice, where helping the wounded is treated as treason, where fear governs more effectively than law. Your Majesty speaks of matters that require what I have decided they require. The Emperor's words ended the discussion with imperial finality. He looked down at Elara, who was still trying to understand how saving her mother had become something so complicated. The choice is your mother's to make, child. I cannot force her to accept, but if she agrees to become my empress, her life will be spared and her name cleared of all charges. And if she refuses, Quintan's expression grew heavy with the weight of justice and law. Then imperial law must take its course. Elara felt the world spinning around her. She'd come seeking simple mercy and found herself at the center of something far beyond her understanding. But one thing remained clear. Her mother's life hung in the balance of a decision no one could have imagined. Can I see her? She asked. Can I talk to my mama? Yes, Emperor Quintan said. You can see her. And tomorrow we'll have her answer. Mira's wedding ring from her late husband was a simple silver band, worn thin by years of work, but polished smooth by constant wearing. Even in the palace dungeons, chained in a cell that smelled of damp stone and despair, she twisted it around her finger, a habit born of grief and maintained by memory. The ring represented everything she'd lost when the wars took her husband, and everything she'd built in the years since his death. The imperial dungeons beneath the palace were nothing like the village jail in Noretia. These cells were carved from living rock, their walls weeping moisture that made everything cold and clammy. A single torch flickered in the corridor outside, casting dancing shadows that turned the stone passages into something from a nightmare. Mira had been here for 3 days, surviving on bread and water while trying to prepare herself for what everyone knew was coming. Tomorrow's trial would be a formality. The evidence against her was clear, the law unforgiving. She'd helped a rebel, however, unknowingly, and the penalty for treason was death. She'd spent the long hours thinking about Elara, praying that the villagers would care for her despite their fear, hoping her daughter would find a way to build a life after losing both parents to circumstances beyond their control. The thought of leaving Elara alone in the world was more agonizing than any physical torture. When footsteps echoed in the corridor, Mira assumed they belonged to guards bringing her evening meal. Instead, she heard a voice that made her heart stop. "Mama!" "Elara." Mira rushed to the cell bars, her chains clanking against stone. "Oh, my darling, what are you doing here? How did you—" "I came to save you, Mama." Elara's small hands reached through the bars to touch her mother's face. "I talked to the Emperor. You what?" Mira's blood turned to ice. "Elara, tell me you didn't." I asked him to help you and he said yes. But there's something else. Elara's voice carried a confusion that broke Mira's heart. He wants to marry you. The words hung in the damp air like a physical presence. Mira stared at her daughter, certain she'd misheard. What did you say? The Emperor. He said he'll save your life if you become his Empress. I don't really understand what that means, but everyone in the throne room looked very surprised. Mira sank onto the stone bench that served as her bed, her mind reeling. He wants to marry me? He said something about the Empire needing heart, and that you have it because you help people and raised me to be brave. Elara pressed her face against the bars. Mama, what's an Empress? An Empress is the Emperor's wife. She helps him rule the Empire. Mira's voice was barely a whisper. Elara, this doesn't make sense. Emperors don't marry common women, especially not accused traitors. But he said he would. He promised to save you if you say yes. The cell door opened with a grinding of ancient hinges, and Emperor Quintan stepped into the corridor. He dismissed his guards and come alone, wearing simple traveling clothes rather than imperial regalia. In the torchlight, he looked more like a tired merchant than the most powerful man in the known world. Mira called well, he said, his voice echoing off stone walls. Mira struggled to her feet, unsure of the proper protocol for greeting an emperor while chained in his dungeons. Your Imperial Majesty, your daughter is remarkably persistent. She's stubborn like her father was, and foolish like her mother, apparently. Mira's voice carried a mixture of pride and terror. Your Majesty, I don't understand what's happening. Elara says you've offered marriage in exchange for my life, but that's impossible. Why is it impossible? The question caught her off guard. Because I'm nobody, a village midwife from a rebellious province. My husband was a carpenter who died fighting your wars. I have no dowry, no bloodline, no political connections that could benefit your reign. And I'm accused of treason. All true, Quintan agreed. And yet your daughter walked through my security as if it were made of morning mist, stood before my throne without fear, and offered to give me anything if I would spare your life. That speaks to remarkable courage and loyalty. Tell me, why did you help the wounded man? Because he was hurt. Mira's answer was immediate and simple. I'm a healer. When someone is bleeding, I help them. I don't ask their politics first, even knowing the risks. I thought about turning him away. The admission was painful, but honest. I knew helping him was dangerous. But in the end, I couldn't watch someone suffer when I had the skill to help. Quintan nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he'd suspected. I've ruled this empire for 20 years. In that time, I've met thousands of people. Nobles who would sacrifice their own mothers for political advantage, merchants who measure everything in profit, soldiers who see only enemies and allies. But I've rarely met someone who acts from simple human decency. There are many good people in your empire, Your Majesty. You just might not encounter them in your throne room. No, I don't. His voice carried a weariness that spoke of profound isolation. Do you know why I've never married? The question was so personal, so unexpected, that Mira didn't know how to respond. I know, Your Majesty, because every woman presented to me was a political calculation. Alliances to be forged, territories to be secured, bloodlines to be merged. I've never met anyone who looked at me and saw simply a man rather than a crown to be captured. I see a man who holds the power of life and death over my daughter and me, Mira said quietly. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. Honest. That's refreshing. Quintan smiled, an expression that transformed his entire face. But when your daughter looked at me, she saw someone who might help her mother. Not the Emperor, just someone with the power to fix what was wrong. There's a difference. Your Majesty, even if what you're proposing were possible, I've been widowed for 5 years. I'm not sure I could love again, especially under such circumstances. I'm not asking for love, Quintan said, though something in his voice suggested he might wish otherwise. I'm asking for partnership. The Empire needs stability, and stability requires an heir. But more than that, it needs leadership that understands mercy as well as justice. Your daughter's courage suggests you might understand both. Mira looked at Elara, who was watching the conversation with wide eyes. understanding perhaps half of what was being discussed, but clearly sensing its importance. And if I refuse, then the law takes its course. You'll be executed at dawn, and Elara will be cared for. I give you my word on that. Mira closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible choice. Accept marriage to a man she didn't know to save her life and stay with her daughter, or refuse and die for the principle of authentic love, leaving Elara orphaned. Mama? Elara's voice was small and frightened. I want you to live. I know, darling. I want that too. Will you give me your answer in the morning? Quintan asked. Yes, Your Majesty. In the morning. After he left, Mira held her daughter through the cell bars, both of them crying for the simplicity they'd lost and the impossible future that lay ahead. Mama, what are you going to do? I don't know yet, sweetheart. I truly don't know. But as she twisted her wedding ring around her finger, Mira wondered if sometimes love meant choosing life over memory, hope over the past. The ancient Treaty of Noritia was a document most scholars believed had been lost to time. Crumbling parchment covered in faded ink, it lay buried in the imperial archives among thousands of other forgotten agreements. But as Chancellor Aldrich discovered, while researching legal precedents to block the Emperor's unprecedented marriage, the treaty contained clauses that would change everything they thought they knew about the current rebellion. At dawn, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the palace windows, Mira stood in the throne room wearing a simple white dress borrowed from one of the servants. She'd removed her wedding ring for the first time in 5 years, placing it carefully in Elara's small hands. Keep this safe for me, she whispered to her daughter. It's a reminder of where we came from. Are you scared, Mama? Terrified, Mira admitted. But sometimes the right choice and the easy choice aren't the same thing. Emperor Quintan entered wearing ceremonial robes that seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. In the early morning light, he looked older than his years, marked by the loneliness of command. But when his eyes met Mira's, something passed between them. Not love, perhaps, but recognition of shared burdens. Have you decided? He asked. Yes. Mira's voice carried across the throne room with quiet dignity. I accept your proposal. The hastily arranged ceremony was unlike any imperial wedding in history. No foreign dignitaries filled the pews. No elaborate preparations had been made for weeks in advance. Instead, a handful of confused courtiers watched as the empire's most powerful man married a woman they'd never heard of until yesterday. General Marcus stood as witness, his weathered face showing approval for reasons he couldn't entirely explain. The palace chaplain performed the ceremony with professional dignity despite his obvious bewilderment, and Elara watched from the front row, clutching her mother's ring and trying to understand how her world had changed so completely. Do you, Quintan Alexander Marcus, Emperor of Aurelia, take this woman to be your wife and empress? I do. Do you, Mira Elena Caldwell, take this man to be your husband and pledge to serve as Empress of Aurelia? Mira hesitated for a heartbeat, then spoke with quiet conviction. I do. The imperial crown of empresses was placed on her head moments later, a weight both physical and symbolic that made her knees buckle slightly. The sapphires caught the morning light like captured sky. But Mira felt more like a prisoner than a queen. Behold, Empress Mira of Aurelia, the chaplain announced to the nearly empty throne room. In the hours that followed, Mira discovered that becoming empress was like being swept up in a whirlwind of protocols, ceremonies and expectations that no one had bothered to explain beforehand. Servants appeared as if from nowhere, addressing her as Your Imperial Majesty and expecting her to know the proper responses. Ladies-in-waiting materialized to dress her in elaborate gowns that cost more than her entire village saw in a year. I don't know how to do this, she confessed to Quintan during a brief moment. Alone between ceremonial obligations, neither did I when I became emperor, he replied. We'll figure it out together. The imperial apartments assigned to her were larger than her entire cottage had been, filled with furnishings that belonged in museums rather than living spaces. Elara wandered through the rooms with wonder. touching silk curtains and marble statues with the careful reverence of someone who'd never seen such luxury. "Mama, there are more books here than in our whole village," she whispered, staring at the library that connected to the Empress's private study. "Then we'll have plenty to read," Mira said, though she was thinking more about the loneliness of rooms too large for human comfort. 3 months into their marriage, something unexpected began to develop between the Emperor and his unlikely Empress. It started with practical discussions about imperial business. Quintan found that Mira's experience with village life gave her insights into problems that had puzzled his advisors for years. The grain shortages in the eastern provinces, she said during one of their evening conversations. "They're not caused by poor harvests. They're caused by poor distribution. When I traveled between villages for difficult births, I saw warehouses full of grain sitting unused while people in the next valley went hungry. The provincial governors assure me that supplies are being distributed efficiently. Then your provincial governors are either lying or incompetent," Mira said with the bluntness that had initially shocked the court. "Probably both," Quintan laughed, actually laughed for the first time in months. "You have a remarkable talent for cutting through political nonsense. It's easier when you're not worried about maintaining your position at court. And you're not worried about that? What's the worst that could happen? You could have me executed. I was going to be executed anyway before we married." Mira's matter-of-fact response made Quintan realize how different she was from every other person in his life, all of whom were constantly calculating how their words might affect their standing with him. Her influence began to show in small ways. When plague broke out in a mining town in the northern provinces, she convinced Quintan to send medical supplies instead of simply quarantining the area and letting the disease run its course. Her knowledge of herbs and healing proved invaluable in organizing the relief effort. The previous emperor, my father, would have burned the town to prevent the plague from spreading. Quintan told her as reports arrived of the successful containment and how many healthy people would have died with the sick ones. He would have said that was unfortunate but necessary for the greater good. Sometimes the greater good includes showing people that their ruler values their lives. It was during this same period that Chancellor Aldrich's resentment began to show more openly. He'd served faithfully for 15 years, watching the empire grow in power and stability under his careful guidance. The sudden appearance of a common-born empress who influenced policy without understanding politics was, in his view, a dangerous development, Your Majesty, he said during a private council session. The Empress's recent suggestions regarding tax relief for the outer provinces are economically unsound. The imperial treasury cannot sustain such reductions. The imperial treasury is quite healthy, Quintan observed. Perhaps too healthy? If people are suffering while we accumulate gold, the empire's strength depends on financial stability. The empire's strength depends on the loyalty of its people, Mira interjected, then caught herself. Forgive me, Chancellor. I didn't mean to interrupt, but Aldrich's face showed that the damage was done. In his eyes, she could see the calculation. This woman was becoming too influential, too comfortable in her role. She was changing the Emperor's perspectives in ways that threatened everything Aldrich had built. That night, as Mira read to Elara from one of the many books in their private library, she found herself thinking about the wounded man who had started everything. During quiet moments, she'd wondered about his identity, about whether he'd survived his injuries, about the cause that had driven him to risk so much. "Mama," Elara said, as she prepared for bed in a room fit for a princess, "do you miss our old life?" "Sometimes," Mira admitted. "Do you?" "Sometimes. But I like that you're safe here. And I think the Emperor is lonely, so maybe we're helping him too." From the mouths of children, Mira thought. Perhaps this strange marriage was serving purposes none of them had originally intended. But in the depths of the imperial archives, Chancellor Aldrich was discovering documents that would prove how much deeper the conspiracy ran than any of them had imagined. Quintan's personal war journal was bound in worn leather and filled with 20 years of his deepest thoughts about leadership, power, and the terrible isolation that came with absolute authority. He'd started writing in it during his first year as emperor, when the weight of decisions affecting millions of lives had nearly crushed him. Now, as autumn deepened around the palace, he found himself writing about things he'd never expected: hope, companionship, and the gradual healing of a heart he'd thought permanently closed. The empire is changing. He wrote by candlelight while Mira slept in the adjoining chamber. Or perhaps I am changing and the empire is simply reflecting that transformation. Mira's influence grows stronger each day, not through political maneuvering, but through simple moral clarity. She sees problems I've been blind to, solutions I've been too rigid to consider. Today, she suggested establishing healing centers in each province, staffed by trained midwives and herbalists. The cost would be minimal, but the impact on loyalty and stability could be enormous. Why did I never think of this? The changes were indeed becoming visible throughout the empire. Provincial governors, accustomed to dealing with an emperor focused primarily on military strength and economic efficiency, found themselves receiving inquiries about healthcare, education, and the welfare of common citizens. Tax policies shifted to provide relief for regions suffering from natural disasters. Trade agreements began, including provisions for fair treatment of workers. Mira had adapted to her role with surprising grace, though she still felt like she was wearing someone else's life. The elaborate gowns and formal protocols remained uncomfortable, but she'd learned to use her position effectively. When requests for aid reached the palace, she often convinced Quintan to approve help that previous emperors would have denied. "You're making me soft," he told her one evening as they reviewed requests from a drought-stricken province. "I'm making you human," she replied, not looking up from the documents. There's a difference. Elara had thrived in ways that surprised everyone. Palace tutors found her remarkably bright, hungry for knowledge, and possessed of a natural curiosity that made teaching her a joy. But she also retained the directness and moral clarity that had brought her to the emperor's attention in the first place. "Papa." "Quintan," she said one morning over breakfast. She'd begun calling him this without being asked, and he'd never corrected her. "Why do some of the nobles look angry when they see Mama?" Quintan and Mira exchanged glances. They'd both noticed the growing tension among certain court factions, led quietly but unmistakably by Chancellor Aldrich. "Change makes some people uncomfortable," Quintan said carefully. "They prefer things to stay the same, but Mama's making things better." "Why would they want things to stay bad?" "Because sometimes people benefit from things being bad for others," Mira explained. Though the complexity of palace politics was difficult to convey to a 7-year-old, the first direct threat came in the form of an anonymous note slipped under Mira's chamber door. "Common blood should not wear imperial crowns. This mistake will be corrected." Mira showed the note to Quintan immediately, but his reaction surprised her. Instead of anger, she saw fear, not for himself, but for her and Elara. "I should have expected this," he said, crumpling the paper in his fist. "I've been naive to think everyone would simply accept our marriage. Who would do this? The question isn't who, it's how many." Quintan began pacing, his mind working through possibilities. "There are always factions in court who oppose any change. Some nobles who think you've stolen a position that should have gone to one of their daughters. Provincial governors who preferred the old ways. Foreign agents who benefit from imperial instability. What do? We become more careful, and we find out who's behind this before they move beyond threats. General Marcus increased security around the imperial family, but the investigation into the threats proved frustrating. Palace servants were questioned, but everyone seemed genuinely ignorant. Guards were rotated and doubled, but no suspicious activities were observed. Meanwhile, Chancellor Aldrich was making discoveries in the archives that excited him far more than the security concerns. The ancient Treaty of Norretia, signed 60 years earlier, contained provisions that few people remembered and fewer understood. According to the document, Noritia had been granted special autonomous status in exchange for providing military support during a border war. That autonomy included the right to grant sanctuary to political refugees, including rebels. More importantly, the treaty established that any imperial citizen born in Noritia could claim protection under these autonomy provisions. And according to birth records Aldrich had painstakingly researched, the wounded man Mira had treated, the rebel who'd triggered her arrest, was her cousin, Marcus Thornfield. The implications were staggering. If Mira had knowingly sheltered a relative, her actions might be interpreted as family loyalty rather than treason. If she'd unknowingly provided sanctuary to someone legally entitled to it under the Noritia Treaty, she'd committed no crime at all. Her marriage to the Emperor, negotiated under the threat of execution for treason, might be legally invalid. But Aldrich saw something else in the documents, an opportunity. If the rebellion in Noritia was being funded by foreign powers, and if Mira's family connections ran deeper than anyone had suspected, she might be an unwitting spy rather than an innocent victim. With careful presentation of evidence, he could convince the Emperor that his new wife represented a threat to imperial security. The first assassination attempt came during a state dinner honoring ambassadors from the Eastern Kingdoms. Mira was tasting her soup, a habit she'd developed, after her mother had warned her about poisoned food, when she noticed the bitter almond scent that her herb training had taught her to associate with certain plant toxins. "Don't eat the soup," she said quietly to Quintan, setting down her spoon. "What? The soup is poisoned. I can smell it." Quintan immediately signaled to General Marcus, who began the complex process of quietly evacuating the dining hall without causing panic among the foreign dignitaries. Within minutes, the palace physician confirmed Mira's suspicion. The soup contained concentrated nightshade extract, enough to kill within hours. "How did you know?" the physician asked, clearly impressed by her detection. "My mother taught me to recognize dangerous plants." She said a midwife who couldn't spot poison was a dead midwife. Mira's attempt at lightness didn't hide her fear. Someone had tried to kill her, and they'd come close to succeeding. The investigation revealed that the poison had been added to the soup after it left the kitchen, during the brief period when servants carried the bowls through a corridor leading to the dining hall. Security in that corridor was minimal. It was considered an internal palace area where threats were unlikely. This was someone with access, General Marcus reported to Quintan and Mira in private. Someone who knew the dinner schedule, the serving routine, and the palace layout. "Someone from inside," Quintan said grimly. That night, as Elara slept safely in her bed under guard protection, Mira and Quintan sat together in their private sitting room, both of them shaken by how close they'd come to disaster. "I'm putting you and Elara in danger by keeping you here," Quintan said. "You're keeping us alive by keeping us here," Mira replied. "Whoever did this won't stop just because we leave. And besides, we're family now. Families face dangers together." It was the first time either of them had used the word family to describe their relationship, and it hung in the air between them like a bridge being built across an impossible chasm. "Are we?" Quintan asked quietly. "A family." "We're trying to be," Mira said. "Isn't that what matters?" "Chancellor." Aldrich's poison ring was a masterpiece of subtle craftsmanship, an ornate signet ring bearing his family crest with a hidden compartment so cleverly designed that it had served him for years without detection. The compartment held concentrated nightshade extract, enough to kill a grown man with just a few drops. It was the same poison that had been intended for Mira's soup, and now it would serve an even more important purpose. The revelation came from the most unexpected source. Elara, unable to sleep after overhearing hushed conversations about the assassination attempt, had wandered the palace corridors despite strict instructions to stay in her chambers. Her small size and natural quietness made her nearly invisible to guards, and her curiosity led her to places where adults wouldn't think to look for listeners. She was hiding behind a tapestry in an alcove near the Chancellor's office when she heard voices through the partially open door. Aldrich was meeting with someone, a man whose accent marked him as foreign, though Elara couldn't identify which kingdom he represented. The poison failed, the stranger was saying. The woman has knowledge that makes her dangerous to our plans. I'm aware of that, Aldrich replied coolly. But her detection of the nightshade confirms what I suspected. She has more training than a simple village midwife should possess. Our sources in Norisha suggest she may have been recruited years ago, though she might not know it herself. Her cousin Marcus has been feeding information to our operatives for months. Elara pressed closer to the wall, her heart racing. They were talking about her mother, about the wounded man, about things she didn't understand, but knew were dangerous. The beauty of it, Aldrich continued, is that she's genuinely innocent. She has no idea her family connections make her valuable to your cause or dangerous to ours. The Emperor believes he married for love and mercy. He has no idea he brought a potential spy into the heart of the Empire. And if he discovers the truth? He won't discover it from investigating the rebellion. He'll discover it when I present him with evidence that his beloved wife has been manipulating him from the beginning. There was satisfaction in Aldrich's voice that made Elara's skin crawl. Her influence over him has grown too strong. She's making him weak, changing policies that have maintained stability for decades. This marriage must end, and the child, collateral damage. The Emperor will understand that sacrifices must be made for imperial security. Elara had heard enough. She crept away from the alcove as quietly as she could, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd discovered. The Chancellor, the man who sat at her stepfather's right hand, was planning to hurt her mother. Maybe to hurt all of them, but who could she tell? Adults rarely believe children about serious matters, and accusing the Chancellor of treason based on an overheard conversation seemed impossible. She needed proof, or at least someone who would listen to her concerns. She found General Marcus in the armory, inspecting weapons with the methodical attention that marked him as a professional soldier. He'd always been kind to her, and unlike the courtiers who saw her as an unfortunate reminder of the Emperor's impulsive marriage, Marcus treated her with the respect due to any member of the imperial family. General Marcus? She said quietly from the doorway. He looked up from the sword he'd been examining. Princess Elara, you should be in bed. I know. But I heard something important, and I don't know who to tell. Something in her tone made him set down the weapon and give her his full attention. What did you hear? Chancellor Aldrich is planning to hurt Mama. He was talking to a foreign man about making Papa Quintan think she's a spy. And he said the wounded man from our village is Mama's cousin, but I don't think Mama knows that. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face showing no expression. Then he knelt down to Elara's eye level. That's a very serious accusation, Princess. Are you certain of what you heard? Yes, sir. They said the poison in the soup was just the beginning. And they talked about my mama having training she doesn't know about, and something about our family being connected to the rebellion. Where did you hear this conversation? Outside the Chancellor's office. I know I wasn't supposed to be there, but I couldn't sleep, and you did the right thing by telling me, Marcus interrupted gently. This is exactly the kind of information I need to know. But now you need to promise me something. Don't mention this to anyone else until I've had time to investigate. Not even Mama and Papa Quintan, especially not them. If the Chancellor suspects we know about his plans, he might do something desperate. That night, while the palace slept, General Marcus began his own investigation. As head of imperial security, he had access to files and resources that revealed disturbing patterns. Communications between Norisha and foreign kingdoms had increased dramatically over the past year. Several known rebels had family connections to people in Mira's village. And most troubling of all, the timing of Mira's arrest seemed almost perfectly designed to create the crisis that had led to her marriage to the Emperor. The pieces began forming a picture that was both more complex and more sinister than anyone had imagined. The rebellion in Norisha wasn't a spontaneous uprising. It was being orchestrated by foreign powers who wanted to destabilize the empire. Mira's cousin Marcus wasn't just a rebel. He was a key operative in a network designed to place agents close to imperial power. But the evidence also suggested that Mira herself was genuinely innocent. Her healing of Marcus had been instinctive kindness, not political calculation. Her acceptance of marriage to Quintan had been motivated by love for her daughter, not by any larger conspiracy. She was a pawn in a game she didn't even know was being played. The most shocking discovery came when Marcus traced the original tip that had led to Mira's arrest. The information had come from someone within the Imperial administration, someone who had access to intelligence reports about rebel activities and knew exactly how to time the revelation for maximum impact. Someone, like Chancellor Aldrich. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Marcus examined the circumstances surrounding Aldrich's recent appointments to key positions. Over the past year, the Chancellor had systematically placed his allies in control of intelligence gathering, provincial communications, and military logistics. He'd been building a network of power that could function independently of the Emperor's direct oversight. Marcus realized with growing horror that they weren't dealing with a simple assassination plot against the Empress. They were uncovering a conspiracy to overthrow Emperor Quintan himself, with Mira's marriage serving as the perfect justification for a coup. The next morning, during the regular security briefing, Aldrich made his move. "Your Majesty," he said, producing a folder thick with documents, "I've discovered information about the Empress that requires your immediate attention." Quintan looked up from the reports he'd been reviewing. "What kind of information?" "Evidence suggesting that her family connections to the rebellion are more extensive than we initially believed. Her cousin, Marcus Thornfield, isn't just any rebel. He's been identified as a key operative in a foreign-sponsored network attempting to destabilize the Empire." Mira, who had been quietly reviewing requests for medical supplies, felt the blood drain from her face. "My cousin Marcus? But I haven't seen him since you treated his wounds in your cottage," Aldrich finished smoothly. "The same wounds he received while escaping from an Imperial garrison he'd helped rebels attack." "I didn't know." "Perhaps not. But the implications remain troubling." Aldrich spread documents across the table. "Communications intercepted from Noritia suggest that your family has been involved in rebel activities for months. Your marriage to the Emperor has provided them with access to Imperial intelligence and decision-making processes." Quintan's face had gone stone cold. "Are you suggesting that my wife is a spy?" "I'm suggesting that she may be an unwitting asset being used by enemies of the Empire. Her influence over your Majesty's policies has been significant. Trade agreements, military deployments, resource allocations, all have been modified based on her recommendations. For the benefit of the people," Mira said desperately. "I've only suggested changes that would help citizens who are suffering. Citizens in regions where rebel activity has increased dramatically," Aldrich pointed out. "Your recommendations have consistently weakened Imperial control in areas where our enemies are strongest." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Quintan stared at his wife, searching her face for some sign of deception, some indication that the woman he'd begun to love might be playing a role she'd never revealed. "This is impossible," he said finally. "Mira wouldn't, she couldn't." "Your Majesty," General Marcus interrupted from the doorway, "I have information that bears on this discussion." And with those words, the real truth began to emerge. The Imperial Seal of Justice was a massive golden stamp that weighed nearly 10 pounds, its intricate engravings depicting the balance of mercy and law that was supposed to guide Imperial decision-making. For 20 years, Emperor Quintan had used it to sign pardons and death warrants, always conscious of the terrible power it represented. Now, as General Marcus laid out evidence of Chancellor Aldrich's treachery on the council table, the seal seemed to grow heavier with each revelation. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had served the crown faithfully for decades, "the conspiracy goes far deeper than an attempt on the Empress's life. Chancellor Aldrich has been orchestrating the entire rebellion from within the palace. Aldrich's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. General, surely you're not suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts based on evidence. Marcus produced a leather portfolio filled with documents. Communications between the Chancellor's office and foreign agents. Financial records showing payments to rebel operatives. And most damning of all, proof that the information leading to the Empress's arrest came from within this administration. Quintan stood slowly, his eyes moving between his Chancellor of 15 years and his General of 20. Explain. The tip that led Imperial soldiers to arrest the Empress was based on intelligence that only someone with access to classified communications could have possessed. Someone knew exactly when and where to look for evidence of rebel activity. Someone who wanted to create a crisis that would destabilize your reign. That's preposterous, Aldrich protested. I've served this empire faithfully. You've served yourself faithfully, Marcus interrupted, using your position to build a network of allies who would support your eventual claim to power. The Empress's marriage to His Majesty disrupted those plans by giving him an heir and stabilizing the succession. Mira had been listening in stunned silence, but now she spoke up. You're saying that my arrest was deliberate? That everything, the trial, the marriage, was part of some larger plan? Your arrest was designed to create instability, Marcus confirmed. Your marriage was supposed to be impossible, forcing the Emperor to choose between mercy and law in a way that would undermine his authority regardless of his decision. But you surprised everyone by accepting the proposal, and the Emperor surprised everyone by making it work. Quintan's voice was dangerously quiet. How long have you known about this? I began investigating after the poison attempt. Princess Elara overheard a conversation between the Chancellor and a foreign operative that provided the first real evidence of the conspiracy. All eyes turned to Elara, who had been sitting quietly in the corner where she'd been forgotten during the adult conversation. She looked frightened but determined as she met the Emperor's gaze. I heard him talking about hurting Mama, she said simply, and about making you think she was bad when she's really good. Aldrich laughed, a sound that held no humor. You're basing accusations of treason on the fantasies of a child. I'm basing them on documentary evidence that corroborates what the child reported, Marcus said coldly. He spread more papers across the table. Communications with the Kingdom of Valdris, promising support for a new imperial government. Financial transfers to known rebel operatives. And most interesting of all, a detailed plan for eliminating the current emperor and establishing a regency under your control. The throne room fell silent, except for the sound of Quintan's breathing, which had become harsh and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried 20 years of imperial authority. Chancellor Aldrich, you stand accused of high treason, conspiracy against the crown, and attempted murder. How do you answer these charges? For a moment, Aldrich's mask slipped completely, revealing the ambition and resentment that had driven years of careful planning. I answer that you've grown weak, Quintan. This marriage to a common woman has made you soft when the empire needs strength. Your policies are bleeding resources to provinces that produce nothing but rebellion. Your mercy is seen as weakness by enemies who would destroy everything we've built, so you decided to destroy it yourself. I decided to save it. Aldrich's voice rose with passion. The old ways maintained order for generations. Your father understood that ruling an empire requires hard choices, sacrifices that lesser men couldn't make. But you let a village midwife change policies that have maintained stability for decades. Mira stood slowly, her face showing a mixture of pain and understanding. It was never about me, was it? I was just a convenient excuse. You were a mistake, Aldrich said with cold finality. A weakness that needed to be corrected. The only mistake, Quintan said, his voice carrying absolute authority, was trusting you. The evidence was overwhelming. Within hours, Marcus's investigation had uncovered a network of corruption and conspiracy that reached into every level of the imperial administration. Foreign gold had purchased loyalty from provincial governors. Rebel activities had been coordinated through official channels, and key military positions had been filled with officers who would support Aldrich's eventual coup. But the most shocking discovery came when they traced the origins of the rebellion itself. The wounded man who had sought refuge in Mira's cottage, her cousin Marcus, had indeed been fleeing Imperial soldiers. But he'd been wounded while trying to escape from rebel forces, not Imperial ones. He'd been attempting to warn the authorities about the foreign-sponsored conspiracy when he'd been attacked by his own supposed allies. He came to you because he knew you would help him regardless of politics. Quintan explained to Mira as they reviewed the intelligence reports. Your reputation for treating anyone who needed help was known throughout Norisha, but Aldrich's agents were watching for any contact between your family and the rebels. When Marcus sought your help, it provided the perfect justification for your arrest. So my cousin was trying to stop the rebellion? He was trying to expose it. His death warrant was signed by Aldrich the day after your arrest, allegedly for providing information to Imperial forces. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. For months, Aldrich had been feeding information to foreign enemies while simultaneously using that information to justify increasingly harsh measures against the provinces. He'd created the very rebellions he claimed to be fighting, then used the threat they represented to consolidate power under his control. What happens now? Mira asked as they sat in their private chambers, Elara finally asleep after a day that had turned her world upside down once again. Now we clean house, Quintan said grimly. Every appointment Aldrich made, every policy he influenced, every ally he placed in key positions, all of it needs to be reviewed and corrected. And Aldrich himself. Quintan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the imperial seal of justice that lay on his desk. The penalty for treason is death. It always has been. But you don't want to execute him. I don't want to become the kind of ruler who solves every problem with an executioner's axe. That's what Aldrich never understood. Mercy isn't weakness. It's strength applied thoughtfully rather than brutally. So what will you do? I don't know yet. But I know what I won't do. I won't let his conspiracy succeed in making me more like him. The next morning brought word that Aldrich had escaped during the night, along with several of his key allies. The guards assigned to watch him had been found drugged but alive, and horses were missing from the Imperial stables. He's fled to Norisha, Marcus reported. Intelligence suggests he's planning to make a final stand there, claiming that he represents the true Imperial government and that you've been corrupted by foreign influences. He's going to use the rebellion as cover for open revolt, Quintan realized. Force me to choose between negotiating with traitors or attacking my own provinces. What are your orders, Your Majesty? Quintan looked at Mira, then at Elara, who was listening with the serious attention that events had forced upon her young mind. 3 months ago, he would have mobilized the Imperial army and crushed the rebellion with overwhelming force. Now, faced with a crisis that threatened everything he'd built, he found himself considering options his younger self would never have contemplated. We go to Norisha, he said finally. Not with an army, but with the truth. Your Majesty, Marcus protested, that's extremely dangerous. Aldrich will have the advantage of familiar territory and rebel support. Aldrich will have the advantage of fear and foreign gold, Quintan corrected. We'll have something more powerful, which is... Quintan looked at his wife, the woman whose simple act of compassion had exposed a conspiracy that could have destroyed the empire. We'll have the people of Norisha deciding between the man who used their suffering for his own ambition and the woman who risked everything to ease that suffering. You're betting the future of the empire on the loyalty of people who barely know you. Marcus warned, I'm betting it on their ability to recognize the difference between someone who serves them and someone who serves himself. Quintan stood, his decision made. Prepare for travel to Norisha. Small escort, no army. If we're wrong about this, we'll face the consequences together. And if we're right, then we'll have proven that an empire built on trust is stronger than one built on fear. As they prepared for what could be their final journey as a family, none of them could know that the confrontation awaiting them in Noritia would test not just their courage, but their faith in the power of mercy to triumph over revenge. Elara's childhood doll was a simple thing made of cloth scraps and stuffed with wool, its face embroidered by her mother's careful hands during long winter evenings in their cottage. She'd carried it with her through the terrifying journey to the capital, through her mother's trial and wedding, through months of palace life that still felt like someone else's dream. Now, as their small party approached the rebel stronghold where Chancellor Aldrich held hostages, the doll clutched in her arms became something more, a reminder of innocent love in a world that had forgotten its power. The journey to Noritia had taken 3 days, but they felt like 3 years. Emperor Quintan rode with only a dozen guards, rejecting all advice to bring a larger force. Mira traveled beside him, wearing a simple traveling dress rather than imperial regalia, while Elara sat before her mother on horseback, watching the familiar landscape of her childhood grow larger with each mile. "Are you frightened?" Quintan asked Mira as they crested the hill that overlooked her home village. "Terrified," she admitted, "but not of dying. I'm frightened of what we might have to live with if this goes wrong." Below them, Noritia showed the scars of months of conflict. Several buildings bore burn marks from fighting, and the marketplace that had once bustled with life stood nearly empty. But people emerged from their homes as word spread of the imperial party's arrival, not to cheer, but to stare in wonder at the village midwife who had somehow become their empress. Mira, called Elena, the woman whose baby Mira had delivered just days before everything changed. "Is it really you?" "It's really me," Mira replied, dismounting to embrace her old friend. "How are you? How is little Anna?" "Growing strong, thanks to you." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "We heard about your marriage, but we couldn't believe it. You're truly the Empress now?" "I'm truly still the same woman who helped bring your daughter into the world." Word spread quickly through the village, and soon a crowd had gathered around the imperial party. These were people who had known Mira all her life, who had watched her tend their sick and deliver their children. Their faces showed confusion, wonder, and something that might have been hope. "Where is Aldrich?" Quintan asked Thomas the baker, who had stepped forward as the village's unofficial spokesman. "In the old fortress," Thomas replied, his voice heavy with worry. "He came 3 days ago with foreign soldiers and some of our young men who'd joined the rebellion. He's holding the Thornfield family, Marcus's parents and sisters, claiming they're traitors who need to answer for their son's crimes." Mira's blood ran cold. "The Thornfields are prisoners. Aldrich says they're being held as examples of what happens to families that harbor rebels. But everyone knows Marcus died trying to expose the conspiracy. These people are innocent. The fortress Thomas mentioned was an ancient structure built into the hillside overlooking Noritia, a relic from the Empire's early days when provincial strongholds were necessary for defense against barbarian raiders. It had been abandoned for decades, but its position made it nearly impregnable to direct assault. "How many men does he have?" General Marcus asked. "Maybe 50, including the foreign soldiers. But he's also got some of our boys who believed his promises about overthrowing the corrupt imperial government." Thomas looked ashamed. "Times have been hard here. When someone comes offering gold and talking about fighting back against imperial taxes, desperate people listen." Quintan studied the fortress through a spyglass, noting the defensive positions and the guards visible on the walls. "He's chosen his ground well. We can't take that place by force without significant casualties." "Then we don't take it by force," Mira said quietly. "What do you suggest?" "We do what you said. We trust the people to choose between truth and lies." Mira looked around at the villagers who had gathered. "These people know me. They know I'm not a spy or a traitor. And if they see Chancellor Aldrich for what he really is, they might be willing to help us. It's dangerous. If Aldrich sees us coming, he already knows we're here. His scouts will have reported our arrival within minutes." Mira's voice carried the calm certainty she'd once used to reassure laboring mothers. The question is whether we approach as conquerors or as people seeking justice. Quintan made his decision. We approach on foot. No weapons drawn, no threatening gestures. If Aldrich wants to kill an unarmed emperor in front of witnesses, he'll have to live with the consequences. Your Majesty, General Marcus protested. That's essentially suicide. It's the only choice that doesn't make us into the very thing we're fighting against. As they prepared for the approach to the fortress, Elara clutched her doll tighter. The simple toy had traveled from a humble cottage to an imperial palace, and now to a confrontation that would determine the fate of an empire. In its button eyes and stitched smile, she found the courage that had carried her into the Emperor's throne room months ago. "Mama," she whispered, "can I help?" "How, sweetheart?" "The soldiers in the fortress, some of them are from our village, right? They might remember me, and they might remember their own children when they see my doll." Mira looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and terror. 7 years old, and already understanding the power of innocence to reach hearts that politics couldn't touch. "You might be right," she said. "But it's dangerous. Everything's dangerous now," Elara replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom that only children possess. "But some dangerous things are also right, and so, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley of Norretia, an emperor, an empress, and a little girl with a cloth doll walked toward a fortress held by traitors, carrying nothing but truth and the hope that love might prove stronger than fear. The broken chains of Norretia had once bound hundreds of prisoners during the fortress's darkest days, when it served as more dungeon than defensive structure. Now Chancellor Aldrich had found them in the ancient armory and put them to use again, shackling the Thornfield family and any villagers who had spoken against his cause. The heavy iron links bore the rust of decades, but they still held strong, a symbol of oppression that Aldrich seemed determined to restore to the empire. As Emperor Quintan, Mira, and Elara approached the fortress gates, Aldrich appeared on the battlements above, flanked by armed men whose foreign features marked them as the promised soldiers from Valdris. His voice carried clearly in the afternoon air, amplified by the stone walls and his own sense of righteous fury. "How convenient," he called down. "The usurper comes to me, saving me the trouble of hunting him down." "Chancellor Aldrich," Quintan replied, his voice calm despite the danger. "Release the hostages and we can discuss your grievances peacefully." "My grievances?" Aldrich laughed, the sound echoing off ancient stones. "My grievance is that you've forgotten what it means to rule an empire. You've let sentiment and weakness guide decisions that should be made with cold calculation. I've let mercy guide decisions that were once made with cruelty. And look where it's brought you, standing before a fortress held by your enemies, with nothing but a peasant wife and her bastard daughter for protection." The insult to Mira and Elara brought murmurs of anger from the villagers who had followed the imperial party to witness the confrontation. These were people who had known Mira all her life, who had watched Elara grow from infant to child. Hearing her called a bastard by someone who didn't know her struck them as fundamentally wrong. "That's Elara Caldwell," called out Sarah the Weaver, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I helped deliver her myself when her father was away at war. She's no bastard, and her mother's worth 10 of you." Aldrich, other voices joined in, people defending Mira's character, recounting times she'd helped their families, expressing outrage at seeing their neighbors held in chains by foreign soldiers. Aldrich's face darkened as he realized his support among the locals was weaker than he'd assumed. Silence. "These people are traitors and collaborators. They've allowed enemies of the Empire to find shelter and support in their village. The only enemy of the Empire I see," Mira called up to him, "is the man who's been orchestrating rebellion from within the palace while innocent people died for his ambition." Innocent. Aldrich gestured to the chained prisoners visible behind him. These people harbored rebels, aided enemies, and undermined imperial authority. "Their guilt is clear. Their guilt is fabricated," Quintan replied. "Just as my wife's was fabricated when you needed a crisis to justify your seizure of power." I needed nothing to justify removing a weak ruler who tried to govern with compassion instead of fear, who listened to the needs of common people instead of just nobles and foreign allies. The exchange was having an effect Aldrich hadn't anticipated. The local rebels, young men from Norretia who had joined his cause, were beginning to look uncertain. They'd been told they were fighting against a corrupt emperor who oppressed their province. But the man standing below didn't seem corrupt, and the woman beside him was someone they'd known and respected all their lives. Elara stepped forward, still clutching her cloth doll, her small voice somehow carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Chancellor Aldrich, why are you hurting people?" "My mama never hurt anyone. She just helps people when they're sick or scared." "Child, you don't understand the complexities of... I understand that you tried to poison my mama. I heard you talking about it." The simple statement, delivered with a child's directness, hit the gathering like a thunderbolt. Gasps rose from the villagers, and even some of Aldrich's own men shifted uncomfortably. The word of a child against the word of a child who has no reason to lie, interrupted Tom Brennan, one of the local rebels. "Elara's never told a falsehood in her life. If she says she heard you planning to poison the Empress, then that's what happened. You're letting a 7-year-old girl dictate military strategy?" "I'm letting a 7-year-old girl remind me what honor looks like," Tom replied, then did something that shocked everyone present. He threw down his weapons and walked toward the Imperial party. The gesture broke something in Aldrich's carefully constructed narrative. If Tom Brennan, whose farm had been seized for unpaid taxes and whose brother had died in Imperial service, could recognize the difference between justice and revenge, then perhaps the whole rebellion was built on lies. Other local rebels began following Tom's example. Not all of them. Some were too committed to the cause or too afraid of the foreign soldiers, but enough to make Aldrich's position suddenly precarious. "Stop," Aldrich commanded, but his voice now carried desperation rather than authority. "These people are enemies of the Empire. They're being manipulated by foreign agents." "The only foreign agents I see," General Marcus called out, having arrived with the rest of the Imperial escort, "are the ones standing beside you." That was when Aldrich made his final desperate gambit. He grabbed Elara's mother roughly, pulling her to the edge of the battlements where everyone could see the knife he held to her throat. "One more step and the Empress dies," he shouted, "and the child will watch." The fortress fell silent except for the sound of wind through ancient stones. Quintan felt his heart stop as he saw the blade against Mira's neck, saw her eyes wide with fear, but still showing trust in him to find a solution. "Let her go, Aldrich," he said quietly. "This is between you and me. This is between the old empire and the new. Between strength and weakness. Between what you were and what you've become." But as Aldrich spoke, he failed to notice Elara moving quietly through the crowd of villagers, her doll tucked under one arm as she approached the fortress gate that stood slightly ajar, an oversight by guards who had been focused on the drama above. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage change everything. The new imperial constitution was written on parchment, made from the finest materials the empire could provide. But its most remarkable feature was not its quality. It was the fact that two distinct handwritings appeared throughout the document. Emperor Quintan's formal script intertwined with Empress Mira's practical penmanship, creating a visual representation of the partnership that had transformed an empire. The document established rights for healing, education, and fair treatment under law, concepts that would have been revolutionary just 1 year earlier. 1 year after a small girl's courage had exposed a conspiracy that could have destroyed everything. The anniversary found the imperial family in Norretia once again, but this time they came not as desperate fugitives seeking justice, but as invited guests celebrating the completion of the province's first imperial healing center. The building stood where the old fortress had once brooded. Over the village, its stones repurposed into something that brought life instead of fear. Large windows let in abundant light, and the scent of healing herbs drifted from carefully tended gardens. Over the entrance, carved in marble that gleamed in the morning sun, with the words, "In memory of Marcus Thornfield and all who died seeking truth." "It's beautiful," Mira said as they toured the facility with Elena, who had been appointed as the center's first director. "Better than I dared imagine when we first discussed the idea." "The design came from Princess Elara's suggestions," Elena replied, smiling at the 8-year-old girl who was carefully examining the herb storage rooms. "She remembered exactly how your old cottage was organized and insisted we include spaces for families to stay when loved ones were being treated." Elara had grown in the past year, but not just in height. The experiences that had forced her to mature beyond her years had also given her a wisdom and compassion that impressed everyone who met her. She still carried her cloth doll occasionally, but now it shared space with books, writing materials, and the small medical instruments Mira had begun teaching her to use. "Papa Quintan," she said, looking up from a cabinet filled with neatly labeled herb containers. "Could we build one of these in every province?" "We're planning exactly that," Quintan replied, kneeling to her level. "Your mother's design has been so successful that governors throughout the empire are requesting their own healing centers." The transformation hadn't been easy. Dismantling Aldrich's network of corruption had taken months of careful investigation. Some of his allies had fled to foreign kingdoms. Others had been tried and convicted of various crimes, and a few had voluntarily confessed their involvement in exchange for lighter sentences. Aldrich himself had survived the confrontation at the fortress, though barely. When Elara had slipped inside and freed the hostages, using keys she'd found hanging carelessly on a peg near the gate, the sudden shift in the balance of power had led to chaos. In the confusion, Aldrich had been wounded by his own foreign allies, who had decided he was more liability than asset. Rather than execute him, Quintan had chosen a different path. Aldrich now lived in a monastery in the mountains, his political ambitions replaced by daily labors of penance and reflection. Reports suggested he was slowly finding peace in a life devoted to service rather than power. "Do you ever regret sparing his life?" Mira asked as they walked through Norisha's rebuilt marketplace later that day. "I regret that it took so long to see what he was becoming," Quintan replied. "But executing him would have made me into the kind of ruler he claimed I was, someone who solves problems with death rather than seeking better solutions." And the foreign kingdoms who supported him are discovering that an empire built on loyalty is much more difficult to destabilize than one built on fear. Trade agreements based on mutual benefit tend to be more durable than those imposed by military threat. The marketplace bustled with activity that reminded Mira of her childhood memories, but with improvements that spoke to the broader changes throughout the empire. A school occupied one corner, where children from surrounding villages could receive education previously available only to the wealthy. A legal office provided services for people who needed help with disputes or documentation. And at the center, where the old well had always drawn people together, stood a new fountain bearing an inscription, "Where mercy flows, justice follows." That evening, as the imperial family prepared to return to the capital, they visited the small cemetery where Mira's husband lay, buried alongside others who had died in the empire's wars. She placed fresh flowers on his grave while Quintan and Elara waited respectfully nearby. "I think he would approve," she said quietly, touching the simple headstone. "He always believed that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they had the chance." "You've proven him right," Quintan replied, taking her hand. "Your influence has touched every corner of the empire." "Our influence," she corrected. "This only worked because we learned to trust each other." As they rode back toward the capital the next morning, Elara sat between her parents, watching the countryside that had become prosperous and peaceful under their joint rule. Villages showed signs of growth and health. Roads were well maintained and safe for travelers, and the people they encountered offered genuine smiles rather than fearful submission. "Mama," Elara said, as their carriage crested a hill that offered a view back toward Norisha, "do you think we'll have a good story to tell my little brother or sister?" Mira's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach, where new life was just beginning to grow. The pregnancy was early yet, known only to her closest family, but it represented hope for the future in the most personal possible way. "I think," she said, looking at Quintan and seeing the joy and anticipation in his eyes, "we'll have the best story of all. About how love conquered fear, how mercy proved stronger than vengeance, and how sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change the world, and about how a little girl's bravery saved an empire," Quintan added, pulling both his wife and daughter close. The carriage rolled on toward the capital, carrying a family that had been forged in crisis and tempered by trial into something stronger than any of them could have imagined. Behind them, the healing center's windows caught the last rays of sunlight, glowing like a beacon of the better world they had built together. In the distance, church bells rang the evening hour, their sound carrying across valleys where people lived without fear, where children could grow up expecting justice rather than simply hoping for survival, and where a village midwife's simple act of compassion had become the foundation of an empire built on the revolutionary idea that power should serve love rather than the other way around. The story that had begun with a desperate plea, "Please, help my mom," had become a legend of how ordinary people could transform the world when they chose. Courage over comfort, mercy over revenge, and hope over despair. And in years to come, when historians wrote about the reign of Emperor Quintan and Empress Mira, they would note that the greatest changes often begin with the smallest voices speaking the simplest truths.